Thank you. Thank you, Philippa. Thank you to the whole team for the great privilege of being here and the great privilege of being able to speak to such an extraordinary audience here today. In my 10 years in the Australian Parliament, I've seen political earthquakes upending the political establishment, not just in my country, but across the developed world. And the epicentre of those earthquakes is a growing divide between the inner cities on the one hand and the regions and suburbs on the other. The so-called flyover towns and suburbs are reshaping politics. A long-term shift of university-educated voters to the left and non-university educated voters to the right is reshaping politics. And I've seen these shifts at a very personal level. Growing up in a farming family outside of a tiny timber milling town near the Snowy Mountains in southern New South Wales, I absorbed the values and beliefs of rural Australia from a very young age. Nimidabel, the town where I grew up, sits on the edge of a large basalt treeless plain called the Monero. Its landscape is etched deep in the souls of its people. Windswept, cold, tinged brown much of the year by harsh frosts and occasional snow in winter, and sun-drenched Australian summers. But it's also starkly beautiful as you gaze out to the snow-covered mountains in the west and the rugged coastal range in the east. And since the first non-Indigenous settlers came from Scotland and Ireland and Northern England, this was a community valuing self-reliance, hard work, tight-knit family, small business, traditional community with a very strong sense of place. There was always a scepticism of big business and big government. But that didn't mean universal support for conservative politics. The Labor movement had deep roots in regional Australia. My family began farming sheep and cattle in the area in the 1830s, and they've passed these values through now 6 generations. And because my parents were big believers in the power of education, I was lucky enough to go off and study economics and law at Sydney University, on to Oxford, and then ultimately ended up at global management consulting firm McKinsey. There could be few contrasts sharper than working in the harsh Monero environment alongside skilled but relatively unschooled horsemen and stockmen versus working as a partner at McKinsey. At McKinsey, much of my work was in primary industries, in agriculture and resources, including working with the New Zealand dairy farmers during the 1990s. And that work meant mediating between the elite global world of food multinationals and people who worked with their hands every day. People who identified deeply with the place where they lived and worked. At that time, those two worlds could at least work together and could even learn from each other. But today, I'm not so sure. Global capital is creating a new set of demands. ESG and DEI are creating a new sense of virtue that is far removed from the world outside of university campuses and boardrooms. And that political divide was tested in Australia just a few short weeks ago. Australians were asked to vote on a proposed constitutional change to entrench a new Indigenous-only body in the Constitution called The Voice. A powerful, well-funded and vocal coalition supported The Voice. Big business, government bureaucracies, state premiers, most media commentators, celebrities, sporting codes, cultural institutions, professional associations, religious leaders and universities combined in an elite wall of consensus never seen before. Against this mighty coalition was suburban and regional Australia with limited resources, limited institutional power and very limited time to think about the issue. With the support of a small committed group of campaign leaders, many of whom are here this week, suburban and regional Australia said no, and the proposal failed. Every state said no. Towns like Nimidabel voted almost 80% against The Voice. By contrast, our elite metropolitan centres voted a strong yes. The referendum highlighted how universities and their metropolitan alumni now have different values, different objectives, and different beliefs to the rest of the country. The decline of mass media and emergence of niche media is certainly part of this, as is the rapid growth of the knowledge economy and the loss of shared religious belief. But whatever the cause, this growing cultural divide is encouraging some to advocate a shift away from conservative economic policies. And I think this is a big mistake. First, the bulk of these suburban and regional households are aspirational. Second, our most successful regional and suburban economies are globally competitive, outward-looking, and driven by a strong sense of local enterprise and local leadership. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, a stable democracy needs to be underpinned by individuals and families who work hard to get ahead, who want to keep more of what they earn, who want to own their own home, and are deeply suspicious of activist agendas. People only preserve what they believe is worth preserving. Take away hope and aspiration, and you take away the will to preserve. All of this says that we need national and local economies that enable opportunity and social mobility. That means a fast-growing, productive economy with low inflation and rising real wages. The current circumstances in Australia, like many developed countries, don't meet that test, testing Australians' optimism for the future. Many Australians believe they're shut out of wealth accumulation by complex regulations and tax regimes, inflexible workplaces, and perhaps most importantly, an elite class of peak bodies, corporations and governments that take a worldview disconnected from their everyday lives. Households are buckling under cost of living pressures as the purchasing power disappears from their pay packets. In Australia, as we've seen globally, the top end of town is largely protected by enormous gains in home values as housing supply has failed to keep up with housing demand. The consequence is a top end of town that is disengaged from the hardship that sees dual income families lining up in queues at food banks. Most of our leaders were cheering for identity politics in our constitution, while ignoring the enormous pressures that double-digit increases in the price of almost everything has wreaked on family budgets and quality of living. And at the heart of this is the end of the era of cheap money and low inflation. Inflation changes politics, including the overdue death of the flawed idea that governments can just keep spending with few consequences. Inflation is the thief in the night for aspiration. It takes from households and gives proceeds to rapacious governments. Diverging economic realities will only deepen the divide in our communities. To bridge that cultural and economic gap, we need to re-embrace an agenda that supports individuals who take responsibility, offering the opportunity to build prosperity for those who seek it and removing regulatory barriers to people's enterprising instincts. Now, in election after election, we see this aspirational constituency looking for a champion. But pandemic responses favoured big government. And that means we have to rebuild our muscle memory with a back-to-basics economic agenda, supporting small business, enterprise and entrepreneurship, delivering an incentive-based tax system, supporting more work, not more welfare, containing the growth in government spending and getting the basics right where government does have a role to play, reliable, affordable energy, well-targeted critical infrastructure and accessible home ownership and an education system that puts outcomes first. The solutions to economic challenges that I've just talked about are helpful to combat the cultural politics that is dividing our cities from our regions as well. Less red tape doesn't just mean freeing up resources for investment, it means less control for bureaucrats and activists to pressure businesses into adopting political causes that ignore their customers. Lower taxes don't just boost families' hip pockets, they mean less wasteful spending for government programs that indoctrinate our children, promote hostile ideologies and buy off crony capitalists. And more flexible workplaces don't just make it easier for people to get jobs, it means the freedom and flexibility for individuals to live the lives they aspire to live. This has been an absolutely wonderful conference so far. I think we are in furious agreement about the importance of a future that preserves the very best of what has led to our extraordinary success. But asking the people of countries like ours to come with us on that journey means giving them a reason to believe in that journey. Economic hope and opportunity is a very good reason to believe in that journey. Thank you very much.